One fateful day in June 2017, a family of 3 was admitted to a UK hospital with harrowing symptoms: diarrhea, vomiting, shortness of breath, and paresthesia. All of you have probably experienced paresthesia before, but you just didn't know that that was the name of it. It's the feeling you get when your limbs fall asleep, this numbness or tingly feeling. So what happened to this family? It turned out they all suffered from ciguatera. Now, who of you does know what ciguatera is? Please hum so we can hear you. Very silent. Now, everyone who does not know what ciguatera is, please hum. Okay, so the majority, that's good, I can tell you something new. So, ciguatera is actually short for ciguatera fish poisoning, and it's a foodborne illness that is caused by so-called ciguatoxins. Those are toxins that are produced by small one-cellular organisms that mainly live in tropical waters, for example, in the Caribbean Sea or the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And then these biotoxins can actually accumulate in fish along the food chain. So if you eat a fish that has eaten other fish, it might contain enough ciguatoxins so you experience symptoms. Ciguatera is actually the most common type of food poisoning caused by marine biotoxins, which is natural toxins that are present in the ocean. There is estimated to be between 20,000 and 50,000 cases of ciguatera per year. But how did a family from the UK end up with a rather tropical foodborne illness? They had bought and eaten frozen fish fillets labeled as red snapper. Red snapper is actually a fish species, Lucianus malabaricus, at least in Germany. But all around the world, there's actually a bunch of fish species that are being sold as red snapper. And the issue is, depending on which particular fish species you get, there's a higher chance that it contains a lot of ciguatoxins. A German study, for example, following an outbreak of ciguatera in 2017, found out that all 11 of the tested fish were actually not Lucianus malabaricus, but Lucianus boha. Here you can see the 2 different types of fish. So on the left, we have Lucianus malabaricus, and on the right, Lucianus boha. And I'm sure all of you can agree with me, I don't really see a difference. And now imagine you don't have the whole fish, you have a fish fillet. Like, no chance. So, the same was actually the case with the UK family. They didn't get Lucianus malabaricus, but Pignalo pignalo. Now, the problem with Lucianus boha, the one to the right, is it's actually known to often contain ciguatoxins. So many countries have actually banned this fish from being sold because of its high risk. So, as you can see, fish species substitution, so getting the wrong fish, can actually have serious health consequences. Fortunately, these are quite rare. Nonetheless, fish fraud is not to be taken lightly, because it definitely leads to a lot of economic impacts and also environmental outcomes. Because of that, food fraud investigators like myself are working hard to make sure that the food you buy is actually what you think it is. And that's no easy task. The US Food and Drug Administration estimates that around 1% of the global food industry are impacted by food fraud, and that's about $40 billion per year. Europol even suggests that more and more cases of food fraud can be attributed to organized crime syndicates. Why? You can make a lot of money with food fraud, and it's much less risky than selling guns or drugs. For example, it's well known that the mafia made a lot of money with fake virgin olive oil. So, as you can see, food fraud is big business. So how can you protect yourself from that? First of all, it's good to have a rough idea about which type of food often gets frauded. And to answer this, you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. First of all, how much money can be made? Food fraud is actually defined as the intentional substitution, alteration, or misrepresentation of foodstuff for financial gain. So the whole point of this is to make money. And of course, you can make more money if you have an expensive item of food and replace some of the expensive ingredients with cheaper ones. That's one of the reasons why among the most frauded types of food, you can find olive oil, honey, and wine. Another question you should ask is there any scarcity right now? Are there certain ingredients hard to come by? So, do you all remember last year's Dubai chocolate craze? You probably didn't, like you noticed. So when all of that was happening, I thought to myself, now there's a chance for food fraud. Why? There was a very high demand within a very short time span and limited ingredients, especially pistachios. Also, there was an insane profit margin because people were willing to pay a lot of money for this item. So I thought there will for sure be some food fraud happening, and some preliminary studies found instances, for example, where pistachio filling was replaced with sesame seeds and then dyed green, which is actually dangerous because sesame is an allergen. These factors contribute to the likelihood of a food being adulterated. Another one is the chance of detection. You probably are aware of this in your own private life. If there's a low chance that someone will find out you did something wrong, there's a higher chance you might actually do it, and let's say take a yogurt that actually belongs to your colleague from the fridge. The same goes for more nefarious actions like food fraud. This means that when there's a lax attitude about food safety regulations or businesses are being audited regularly, this can also increase the chance of fraud. Same goes for types of fraud that are hard to detect. If it's hard to test for a type of fraud, the chance of detection is lower and it might also increase the chances. But I'm getting away from the fishy business, so let's get back to seafood fraud. Which types of fraud can actually occur with seafood? I already talked about a very well-known example, which is species substitution. This does not only happen for fish, but can also happen with other types of seafood. For example, do you know the difference between scampi and shrimp? They're different? I've shown them here. Now another little question for you. Who of you thinks that the animal on the right is a scampi? Please hum. Who thinks the one on the left is a scampi? Please hum. Okay, a slight favor for the one on the left. You're right, you know your seafood. So, scampi is actually the one on the left, the one with the claws. Scampi and shrimp, sometimes you might get the feeling at restaurants, these are two words for the same thing. No, those are very different animals with different sizes, anatomy, price points, and tastes. And sometimes restaurants are a bit flexible and might sell something as a scampi dish that actually contains shrimp. So pay attention. Generally, species substitution is more common when the food is processed. So when you have peeled shrimp or a fish fillet instead of a whole fish, because again, it's harder to detect. But species substitution isn't the only type of fish fraud that's going on. Another one is the misrepresentation of the origin of the fish. For example, fish raised in aquaculture might get sold as wild caught. Another one is that the origin or the part of the ocean where a fish was caught might be misrepresented. This has actually serious consequences on the economy, on the environment, and can have impacts on health. So if you get back to the ciguatoxins, depending on which area in the ocean you get your fish from, it might have higher contents of ciguatoxins. The impact on the environment is also quite large. I'm sure as you're all aware, there are quotas in place that limit which type of fish can be caught where and with which methods. And by circumventing these regulations, this can damage whole ecosystems and deplete fish stocks. Also, it leads to price dumping, which means that fisheries that actually try to fish sustainable and pay attention to these regulations can't compete anymore with the prices and are getting pushed out of the business. Now, neither the species substitution nor this passport forgery is actually the most common type of fish fraud. Do you know what is? It's short weighing. So that's when basically water gets sold for the price of fish. So have you ever paid attention to how fish fillets look like when you buy them frozen? They usually have a small layer of ice on them. That's perfectly normal. That prevents this fish from drying out. However, some companies are rather, let's say, generous with the amount of water they use in freezing the fish. And that, of course, is not allowed because, again, you're selling water for the price of fish. Some companies might even treat the fish so that it actually soaks up and retains the water. So, how can you detect this type of fish fraud? Let's start with short weighing. This you can actually test yourself at home. Simply thaw the fish fillet, get rid of the water, and weigh the fish. If it's much less than what it's supposed to be, something's going on. A little bit of variation is normal, though. This, of course, gets much harder when the fish is treated so that it retains the water. This you can't test at home. For that, you need a lab. And labs, for example, can determine the water content of a fish and compare it to the protein content. That's one method. So let's get to the species substitution. How can you test for that? For that, you will also need a lab so that you can do some DNA profiling. You've all seen this in one series or another, like the Tatort, how they catch the murderer by comparing DNA they found at the crime scene to a suspect. You can do the same with fish. So simply compare the DNA of the fish in question to the DNA of the species it's supposed to be, and maybe a couple of other candidates. This gets much harder when the fish is cooked, because DNA degrades at higher temperatures. Because of that, some researchers prefer to use proteins instead of DNA. I'm one of those researchers because my area of expertise is protein analysis, so of course I'm a big fan of proteins. So how do I go about this? I use a technique called proteomics, which is the large-scale study of proteins. So I'm not looking at one protein or 2 or 12, I'm looking at hundreds to thousands of proteins in a sample. And for that, I use an instrument called mass spectrometer. It's called like this because you can measure the mass of ions with this thing. And that's very useful because this you can use to then identify and quantify proteins. So find out which proteins you have in a sample and how much of them. Generally, you can use a mass spectrometer in 2 different settings for proteomics. You can do untargeted or targeted proteomics. In untargeted proteomics, the instrument basically scans the whole sample and just measures the most intense signals, usually. And with that, you get sort of an overview of what you can find in there, which is quite a lot. Depending on the instrument you use, you can find between 5,000 to 8,000 proteins. This is very useful when you want to come up with new hypotheses, because with this method, you don't need to know what you're looking for. You can simply see what you find. And that's actually quite unusual for analytical methods. For most analytical methods, you need to know exactly what you're looking for so you can measure it. For example, if you remember the horse lasagna scandal from like 10, 15 years back, where they substituted some beef with horse meat. Back then, beef was actually regularly tested for substitution with other meats, but just they tested for pork or chicken. Nobody thought of testing whether horse meat was in there. But once they started looking, did they find stuff? Wow. And that's more common for analytical methods. Targeted proteomics works the same. So here, actually, you program the instrument so it looks at just a couple of proteins you tell it to look at. So it's much less. It's between 5 to 500. Now you might ask yourself, why would anyone use this method when you have this? Because targeted proteomics is more precise. You get better quantification results. And because of that, it's better to test new hypotheses or to develop routine methods. For example, once you have a biomarker that distinguishes a fish species from another, you would then develop a method for this biomarker just in this targeted mode that's then very precise. All right. But I guess most of you don't have a mass spectrometer lying around. So what can you do yourself at home? First of all, I think this goes for many things in life. Ask yourself a very simple question. Is this too cheap to be true? If something is very, very cheap, it probably is too good to be true. So think twice before buying very cheap seafood. Second of all, what can you do additionally? Inform yourself, for example, about sustainable fish options. I talked before about how, depending on where you get fish from, this can have different impacts on the environment. So check out different fish guides. There's a couple of them you can find online, for example, by the World Wildlife Fund or the Tunen Institute, and they list different fish species and regions of the ocean where it's still environmentally conscious to eat these fish. In restaurants or shops, ask questions. Ask, is this actually really scampi because this looks like shrimp to me? You can do that. And lastly, if you buy fish at the supermarket, you can look at the label on this. So this is actually mandatory for all fish that's sold in the European Union. It has to say the name of the fish, which is the commercial name, and the scientific name, like salmon salar. It needs to specify whether the fish was raised in aquaculture or caught in the wild, and then also the origin. So for aquaculture, it needs to state the country, and then for wild-caught fish, it actually needs to specify the specific zone of the ocean. So the whole ocean is divided up into 26 main zones that are then divided into many more subzones. So for example, the Mediterranean is divided into 4 smaller subzones and in total 10 smallest zones, so to speak, and these need to be specified. Another very interesting or important thing is the method, how this fish was caught. Because depending on this method, it can have very different effects on the environment. So the one that's one of the worst is bottom trawling. That's when you have big nets that are being dragged across the ocean floor. You can imagine that that's not very good for the environment. And there's better ways to go about this. These labels are unfortunately only mandatory for unprocessed fish. So if you buy whole fish fillets. Once, for example, you get fish sticks where there's bread attached, or schlemmerfilet or something like that, this is no longer mandatory. But many companies actually do this voluntarily and provide information, even on those products. This is, for example, necessary when you want to have the MSC certificate, the Marine Stewardship Council, this blue thing. You've probably seen it before. All right. So with this, I hope I could give you a small insight into the fascinating world of fish fraud and also inspire you to become a food detective today. Thank you.